The encounter. It was an ordinary Thursday evening in Houston, Texas, and the Pinecrest shopping plaza was alive with activity. Shoppers bustled between stores, carrying bags and exchanging pleasantries, eager to finish their errands before the weekend rush. The warm glow of the setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, and the air buzzed with a casual energy typical of an end-of-day shopping spree. Among the crowd was Alicia Thompson, a woman in her mid-30s, wearing a comfortable pair of jeans and a navy blue t-shirt. She stood beside her car, carefully placing her grocery bags in the trunk, her face calm and focused. Alicia's appearance was unassuming. She looked like any other Houston resident winding down after a long day. But there was something about her that set her apart, something that only those who knew her well would understand. Alicia was a black belt in karate, a title she had earned through years of discipline, hard work, and countless hours of training. Her father had introduced her to martial arts as a teenager, teaching her the values of self-control, respect, and inner strength. And while she rarely thought of her skills as she went about her daily life, they were an inseparable part of her identity, a quiet confidence that radiated beneath her unassuming exterior. As Alicia closed her trunk and fished her keys from her pocket, she felt a subtle, unsettling gaze on her. She looked up and saw a police cruiser parked near the entrance of a discount store, its engine idling. The officer inside was watching her intently. She could see his face, partially obscured by the shadows inside the car. His eyes narrowed and fixed on her, with an expression that was far from friendly. Officer Mark Williams was known around the precinct as a man who didn't mince words and often took his role as an enforcer of the law to the extreme. He had a reputation for being quick to action, sometimes unnecessarily so, and while he insisted that he treated everyone equally, his colleagues knew he had a pattern, a certain harshness that emerged whenever he dealt with minorities. Some thought of him as tough, but others whispered that his aggression bordered on prejudice. Despite complaints from civilians, his record remained mostly clean, thanks to a system that often overlooked the quiet, everyday injustices of officers like him. Alicia looked away, hoping the officer would lose interest, but she felt his gaze only intensify. She took a steadying breath, reminding herself that she hadn't done anything wrong. She was simply a woman finishing her shopping, but as she started toward the driver's side door, Officer Williams stepped out of his cruiser, adjusting his belt and striding over to her with purpose. "Hey, you there," he called out, his tone sharp and commanding. Alicia froze, confused. She looked around, wondering if he was addressing someone else, but there was no one nearby. Slowly, she turned to face him, her face calm, but her mind racing. "Is something wrong, officer?" she asked politely. Officer Williams's expression didn't soften. He stood in front of her, arms crossed over his chest, and looked her up and down, as if assessing a threat. "License and registration," he demanded, his voice cold. Alicia's brow furrowed. "For what?" she asked, keeping her tone measured. "I'm parked here, not driving. I haven't done anything." His eyes narrowed, a flash of irritation crossing his face. "Are you questioning me?" he asked, stepping closer. "When a police officer asks you for identification, you hand it over. Do you understand?" Alicia felt a spark of anger flare within her, but she forced it down. She knew better than to escalate things, especially with someone who seemed as tightly wounded as this officer. Calmly, she reached into her purse, pulled out her driver's license, and handed it to him. "Here's my license," she said, her voice steady but firm. He took it, barely glancing at it before thrusting it back at her. "Registration too," he barked, his tone growing harsher. Alicia took a deep breath, her patience wearing thin. "I don't understand what this is about," she said, her voice still respectful, but now edged with frustration. "Is there a reason you're questioning me?" For a moment, Officer Williams's mask of professionalism slipped, and something darker surfaced in his expression. He stepped closer, his face inches from hers. "Listen here," he hissed, his tone dripping with contempt. "I've had enough lip from you people." The words hit Alicia like a slap, and for a moment, she was too stunned to respond. "You people," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. She felt her heart pounding, anger rising within her. She was no stranger to prejudice. She had faced subtle forms of it all her life. But this was different. This was blatant, raw hostility, and it was coming from someone who was supposed to protect and serve. She steadied herself, taking a deep breath and choosing her words carefully. "Officer, I'm not causing any trouble here. I've complied with your requests. I would appreciate it if you treated me with respect." But Officer Williams was past listening. With a sneer, he reached out and grabbed her arm, yanking her forward with unnecessary force. "You're resisting arrest," he declared loudly, his voice carrying across the parking lot. Alicia's mind reeled. She hadn't resisted anything. She hadn't even raised her voice. But as she looked around, she saw that people had started to notice the commotion. A small crowd was gathering, some holding their phones, recording the incident. Concerned faces watched as the officer twisted her arm, holding her in a grip that was more about asserting power than maintaining order. Alicia felt her instincts kicking in, the years of training and discipline bubbling to the surface. She didn't want to fight. Violence was never her first choice, and she knew the potential consequences of challenging an officer. But as he tightened his grip, pulling her arm behind her back, she realized she had only two choices: submit to his unjust treatment or stand up for herself. "Please let go of my arm," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I haven't done anything wrong." But Officer Williams wasn't listening. He leaned in closer, his face a twisted mask of anger and disdain. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" he sneered, his tone laced with venom. "You think you can just walk around here, ignoring authority." That was the breaking point. Alicia's years of training took over, her body responding almost instinctively. With a swift, fluid motion, she twisted her arm free, her movements precise and controlled. She stepped back, her stance steady, her gaze unwavering. The officer's face twisted in fury, his pride wounded. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged, especially not in public. His hand went to his baton, pulling it from his belt with a quick flick of his wrist, his eyes blazing with a dangerous mix of rage and humiliation. Alicia's heart raced, but she remained calm, her mind calculating her next move. She didn't want this to escalate further, but she could see that Officer Williams was beyond reason. She stood her ground, ready to defend herself if he attacked. And he did. With a snarl, he swung the baton at her, aiming for her shoulder. But Alicia was quicker. She sidestepped gracefully, her movements honed from years of practice, and the baton sliced through the air where she had stood just seconds before. The crowd gasped, their phones capturing every moment, every swing of the officer's baton, every step Alicia took to avoid his attacks. "Stop!" someone in the crowd shouted, but Officer Williams didn't seem to hear. He swung again, his attacks wild and unrestrained, each one fueled by his bruised ego. But Alicia deflected every blow with ease, her movements controlled, her breathing steady. She was no longer a woman defending herself. She was a trained martial artist, using her skills to avoid harm and de-escalate the situation. Finally, in one swift move, she blocked his swing and delivered a precise, controlled strike to his forearm. The baton slipped from his grasp, clattering to the ground. The crowd erupted into cheers, a mix of shock and admiration filling the air. Alicia didn't gloat or make a spectacle. She simply took a step back, her stance relaxed but ready, her eyes meeting the officer's with a look of calm defiance. "Stand down, officer," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I don't want to hurt you. I'm only defending myself." But Officer Williams's face was flushed with rage and embarrassment. His breathing was heavy, his fists clenched, and for a moment, he looked as if he would charge at her again. But then he looked around, seeing the phones pointed at him, the eyes of the crowd watching his every move. Reality seemed to settle in, the weight of his actions catching up to him. Alicia held her ground, her gaze unwavering. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing. She would not back down, not after enduring his mistreatment, not after standing up for herself. In that moment, she was no longer just Alicia Thompson, an ordinary woman shopping in Houston. She was a symbol of resilience, of strength in the face of injustice, and she knew that her actions would resonate far beyond this parking lot. A crowd gathers. The parking lot fell into a tense silence as Alicia and Officer Williams stood face to face, the baton still lying on the ground between them. The officer's face was flushed with anger, his jaw clenched tightly as he fought to maintain control of the situation. Alicia, on the other hand, stood with calm, composed poise, her hands relaxed at her sides, but ready to act if necessary. Her years of martial arts training had taught her not only how to defend herself physically, but also how to maintain mental clarity in moments of crisis. And right now, her mind was razor sharp. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered, drawn by the sounds of shouting and the unmistakable tension that hung in the air. People whispered to one another, phones held aloft as they recorded the scene. Some wore expressions of shock, others of admiration, and a few looked on with barely contained anger at what they were witnessing. Alicia could hear fragments of their conversations, snippets of support mixed with disbelief. "Did you see that? She blocked every one of his swings. She didn't even hit him. She's just defending herself. Why's he acting like that? She hasn't done anything wrong." The murmurs gave Alicia strength. She felt a surge of pride that she hadn't allowed Officer Williams's aggression to intimidate her, that she had refused to be bullied or belittled. But even as she stood her ground, a part of her feared what might come next. She knew the risks of challenging an officer in uniform, especially one with a reputation like Williams. Officer Williams's gaze swept over the crowd, his eyes narrowing as he registered the number of phones pointed in his direction. He seemed to realize, belatedly, that this confrontation was no longer a private matter. It was now a public spectacle, and every one of his actions was being scrutinized. For a brief moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, as if he was reconsidering his next move. But his ego wouldn't allow him to back down. Not here, not in front of so many witnesses. Alicia watched him carefully, every muscle in her body attuned to his slightest movements. She knew that Williams was a man used to getting his way, used to exercising authority without question. And now she had become a challenge to that authority. A challenge he seemed determined to crush. "Pick up the baton," he snarled, his voice low but filled with menace. "Pick it up and hand it to me. Now." Alicia glanced down at the baton, lying on the asphalt between them, but she didn't move. She knew that bending down would put her in a vulnerable position, giving him an opening to regain control. She also knew that this wasn't about the baton. It was about power, about forcing her to submit to his will, to make her feel small and afraid. "No, officer," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not touching it. If you want it, you can pick it up yourself." His eyes blazed with fury, his face contorting with anger at her defiance. The crowd grew still, sensing the escalation, and Alicia could feel their eyes on her, a collective hope that she would stand her ground. She could almost hear the silent encouragement radiating from them, a wave of support that strengthened her resolve. Officer Williams took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're really pushing it, lady," he growled, his voice barely a whisper but dripping with venom. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" Alicia met his gaze without flinching. "I think the real question, officer, is if you know who you're dealing with. I'm not someone who's just going to stand here and let you intimidate me." For a split second, a flicker of doubt crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by an even deeper rage. His hand twitched, as if he was resisting the urge to lash out again, and Alicia braced herself, ready to move at a moment's notice. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice called out, breaking the tension, "Hey, leave her alone. She hasn't done anything wrong." Another voice joined in, "Yeah, we saw everything. She was just defending herself." The support seemed to catch Officer Williams off guard. His gaze flicked toward the crowd, his scowl deepening as he realized that public sentiment was not on his side. For the first time, Alicia saw a glimmer of vulnerability in his eyes, a hint that perhaps he was beginning to understand the gravity of his actions, that his unchecked aggression had backfired spectacularly. One of the bystanders, an older woman with graying hair and a determined expression, stepped forward, her phone held high as she continued to record. "You're supposed to protect and serve," she said, her voice loud and clear. "But here you are, harassing an innocent woman for no reason." Williams turned his glare on the woman, but she didn't back down. Instead, she raised her voice, speaking to the crowd. "This is exactly why we need to stand up against abuse of power. This officer is out of line, and we're not going to stand by and watch." The crowd murmured in agreement, a few people even clapping and nodding their heads. Alicia felt a surge of gratitude toward the woman, her courage a reminder that she wasn't alone. She took a deep breath, standing a little taller, feeling the strength of the community behind her. Williams, however, wasn't ready to concede. He sneered at the crowd, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think you're helping. Recording me won't change anything. You people think you can just disobey the law whenever it suits you." The crowd bristled at his words, his hostility only serving to unite them further. More voices rose up, each one denouncing his actions, each one a powerful reminder that his authority was not absolute. Alicia felt a renewed sense of resolve. She had spent years training in self-defense, learning not just how to fight, but when to stand up for herself. This was her moment to show that her strength wasn't limited to physical ability. It was rooted in her courage, her dignity, and her refusal to be diminished. Taking a step forward, she addressed him directly, her voice steady and unwavering. "Officer, I have respected you. I complied with your requests, and I did nothing to provoke this. But you have no right to treat me this way. I will not be intimidated, and I will not let you disrespect me simply because you wear a badge." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was a stunned silence. The crowd watched, breathless, as the dynamic shifted. She had taken control, standing her ground with a calm authority that left no room for doubt. She was no longer the target of his aggression. She had become the voice of resistance, a symbol of resilience in the face of injustice. Williams's face twisted with frustration, his anger giving way to something else, a hint of fear, masked by bravado. He took a step back, his confidence faltering as he saw the cameras pointed at him, recording every second. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that his actions would have consequences, that he would be held accountable by a crowd that was no longer willing to look the other way. Just then, a siren wailed in the distance, growing louder as another police car pulled into the parking lot. The crowd parted as the new arrival parked nearby, and two officers stepped out, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern as they took in the scene before them. One of the officers, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached Williams, her brow furrowed. "What's going on here, Williams?" she asked, her tone sharp. Williams stammered, his bravado slipping further as he struggled to explain. I was just trying to detain this woman," he said, gesturing vaguely toward Alicia. She was being uncooperative. The female officer turned to Alicia, her expression softening. "Ma'am, is this true?" Alicia shook her head, meeting the officer's gaze with calm determination. "No, officer. I was simply loading my groceries when he approached me and demanded my license without any explanation. I complied, but he continued to escalate things, even accusing me of resisting arrest when I hadn't done anything." The officer looked from Alicia to Williams, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the situation. She glanced at the crowd, many of whom were still recording, and it was clear that her suspicions were growing. Turning to Williams, she spoke in a low, firm tone. "Williams, step aside. We're going to handle this from here." Williams opened his mouth to protest, but one look from his colleague silenced him. He stepped back, his face red with anger and embarrassment, as the female officer addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for being here and for recording this incident. We'll be reviewing the footage and conducting a full investigation. Your presence is important, and we appreciate your cooperation." The crowd murmured in approval, a few people nodding and expressing their gratitude. Alicia felt a weight lift from her shoulders, her relief tempered by the knowledge that the ordeal wasn't quite over. But she also felt a profound sense of validation. She had stood up for herself, refusing to be intimidated or silenced, and the support of the community had been a powerful reminder that her voice mattered. The female officer turned to Alicia, her expression respectful. "Ma'am, if you'd like, we can take a formal statement from you. This will help with the investigation and ensure that any misconduct is properly addressed." Alicia nodded, feeling a swell of gratitude toward the officer. "Thank you. I would appreciate that." As they walked toward the second police car, the crowd began to disperse, some people coming up to Alicia to offer words of support and encouragement. She felt a sense of pride mixed with humility, knowing that her actions had resonated with so many. And as she sat in the police car, recounting her experience for the report, she knew that this moment would stay with her forever. She had faced aggression with resilience, hostility with dignity, and prejudice with strength. And in doing so, she had proven that standing up for oneself was not only a personal act of courage, it was a powerful message of hope for everyone watching. The fallout. In the days that followed the confrontation at Pinecrest Shopping Plaza, the incident went viral. Video clips of Officer Williams's aggressive behavior and Alicia's calm yet defiant response flooded social media, news sites, and television broadcasts across the country. People were captivated by the footage of Alicia standing her ground, defending herself with a quiet dignity that resonated deeply with viewers everywhere. The video became a rallying cry for many, a symbol of resilience and the power of one voice to stand against abuse of authority. For Alicia, however, the experience was anything but triumphant. She found herself at the center of a media storm she hadn't asked for, her name plastered across headlines, her face familiar to millions of strangers. Her phone rang constantly, journalists and talk show hosts wanting her side of the story, civil rights organizations reaching out to offer support, even strangers sending messages of solidarity and gratitude. Friends and family members called to check in on her, some expressing pride in her strength, others concerned for her safety. The attention was overwhelming, and Alicia felt as though her life had been turned upside down. On the third day after they ate, Carla helped Alicia sort through some of the messages. As they went through the pile, one letter caught Alicia's eye. It was a handwritten note from a young girl, no older than 15, who wrote about her own experiences with bullying and how watching Alicia's video had given her the courage to stand up for herself. The letter was heartfelt, raw, and it left Alicia speechless. "This," she said softly, holding up the letter for Carla to see. "This is why it matters. If I can help even one person find their strength, then maybe this is worth it." Carla smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "That's the Alicia I know." Over the next few weeks, Alicia cautiously began to step into her new role as an advocate. She agreed to a few interviews, focusing not on the confrontation itself, but on the broader issues it represented: accountability in law enforcement, the importance of standing up for one's rights, and the power of community support. Each interview was a test of her resolve, but with each one, she felt her confidence growing. She was learning to use her voice in ways she hadn't before, and it was both empowering and terrifying. Meanwhile, the Houston Police Department launched a formal investigation into Officer Williams's conduct. The videos, combined with Alicia's statement and witness testimonies, painted a damning picture of his behavior. Activists and local leaders demanded accountability, calling for a thorough review of his record and for disciplinary action. The pressure mounted, and soon, the department had no choice but to place Williams on administrative leave pending the investigation's outcome. For Officer Williams, the fallout was swift and severe. He found himself under scrutiny not only from his superiors, but from the public as well. His reputation, once seen as that of a tough but fair cop, was now tarnished by accusations of prejudice and abuse of power. The precinct was bombarded with calls and emails, citizens demanding answers and justice. Williams had never imagined that a single encounter could lead to such upheaval, and he struggled to process the consequences of his actions. In a desperate attempt to salvage his career, Williams sought out a lawyer and began planning his defense, claiming that he had acted in self-defense and that Alicia's actions had provoked him. But the videos told a different story, and each time he watched them, he felt a knot of anger and humiliation in his gut. He had been outmaneuvered, outclassed, and ultimately exposed for who he really was. And the world was watching. For Alicia, life settled into a strange new rhythm. She continued her work as an advocate, attending community meetings, speaking at rallies, and collaborating with local organizations focused on police reform. The support she received was immense, but there were challenges as well. She faced criticism from those who accused her of playing the victim or seeking fame, accusations that stung but did little to deter her. She knew her truth, and she was determined to stay grounded in it. One evening, Alicia was invited to speak at a community event hosted by a civil rights organization. She stood before a crowd of hundreds, her heart pounding as she looked out at the faces of people from all walks of life, young and old, black and white, each one there to listen, to learn, and to stand in solidarity. Taking a deep breath, she began. When I stood in that parking lot, facing down someone who was supposed to protect me, I felt a range of emotions: fear, anger, disbelief. But in that moment, I knew I had a choice. I could allow myself to be intimidated, or I could stand up for my dignity, my humanity. I chose the latter, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. The crowd listened in silence, their attention rapt as she shared her story. She spoke of the courage it took to stand her ground, the strength she drew from her community, and the importance of holding those in power accountable. Her words were both a call to action and a message of hope, a reminder that change was possible, but only if people were willing to demand it. After her speech, people approached her, some with tears in their eyes, thanking her for her bravery, for being a voice they could rally behind. Alicia felt humbled, grateful, and a little overwhelmed. She was just one person, but she had become part of something much bigger, a movement, a collective push for justice and equality. Meanwhile, back at the Houston Police Department, the investigation into Officer Williams's conduct continued to deepen. Witnesses came forward, not only from the shopping plaza but also from previous incidents. Stories emerged of similar encounters, complaints that had been swept under the rug, incidents of excessive force that had gone unpunished. The department was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that Williams's behavior was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern. Finally, after weeks of mounting pressure, the department announced its decision. Officer Williams would be terminated, and an internal review of the precinct's practices would be conducted to address systemic issues within the department. The news spread quickly, and for many, it felt like a victory. But Alicia knew that this was only the beginning. Change would not come overnight, and there would be resistance, setbacks, and challenges along the way. Still, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, a belief that her actions had contributed to something meaningful, something lasting. In the quiet of her apartment that evening, Alicia sat down and penned a letter to herself, a reminder of the journey she had been on, the strength she had discovered, and the lives she had touched. She wrote about the fear, the doubt, the courage, and the solidarity that had carried her through. And as she finished, she felt a sense of peace settle over her, a calm assurance that she was exactly where she needed to be. She closed the letter with a simple line: "I am enough. I have always been enough." And in that moment, Alicia knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the same grace and resilience that had carried her through that fateful night at the shopping plaza. She was no longer just a woman defending herself. She was a symbol of strength, a beacon of hope, and a force for change. A new path unfolds. The morning air was crisp as Alicia made her way to the community center where she had been invited to speak. Since the incident with Officer Williams, Her life had been a whirlwind of public appearances, interviews, and community events. Each one came with its own weight of expectation, each one a reminder of the responsibility she now carried. Alicia hadn't planned on becoming an advocate for change, but as the weeks passed, she found herself embracing the role with a new sense of purpose. As she entered the community center, she was greeted by smiling faces and warm handshakes. The building was alive with activity. Volunteers were setting up chairs in rows, adjusting microphones, and arranging tables with refreshments. People of all ages filled the space, their anticipation palpable. Some were familiar faces from past events, others new, but all of them had come to hear her speak, to be part of this collective push for justice and accountability. Alicia glanced around, feeling both humbled and a bit overwhelmed. She had never thought of herself as a public speaker, let alone a figure people would look up to. But each time she stepped up to the podium, she reminded herself that this wasn't about her. It was about a movement, a call to action that went beyond one person's story. And as long as she could keep that in mind, she knew she would find the strength to keep going. She was setting up her notes when a young woman approached her, holding a notepad and a nervous smile. She looked to be in her early 20s, with dark curly hair and a bright, inquisitive gaze. "Miss Thompson," the young woman asked, her voice tinged with excitement. "I'm Nia, a journalism student at the University of Houston. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions before your talk, if that's all right." Alicia nodded, offering a friendly smile. "Of course, Nia. I have a few minutes before we start. What would you like to know?" Nia's eyes sparkled as she opened her notepad. "Thank you. I've been following your story closely, and I'm really inspired by the way you've handled everything. I think a lot of people would love to know. What has this experience taught you about yourself?" Alicia took a deep breath, considering the question. She had been asked about the incident countless times, but rarely had anyone asked her what it had meant to her on a personal level. "Honestly, it's been a journey of self-discovery," she began, choosing her words carefully. "Before all this, I thought I was just an ordinary woman going about my life. But standing up for myself that night, it showed me a strength I didn't know I had. It reminded me that I have a voice, and that my voice can make a difference. It's empowering, but it's also humbling, because I know I'm just one part of a much larger movement." Nia nodded, her pen moving rapidly across the page. "That's amazing. And what's next for you? Do you see yourself continuing to advocate for these issues?" Alicia hesitated, feeling the weight of the question. The past few weeks had been intense, filled with both support and scrutiny. She had spoken at events, met with community leaders, and shared her story countless times. And while she was grateful for the platform she had been given, part of her longed for the quiet, simple life she'd had before all this began. "I think I have to," she replied. "Finally, I can't turn my back on this now. There are too many people who have been affected by the same issues, too many voices that have gone unheard. I don't know exactly what my path will look like, but I know that I want to be part of the solution." Nia looked up from her notepad, her expression filled with admiration. "Thank you, Miss Thompson. I think a lot of people are going to be inspired by your words today." Alicia smiled, feeling a swell of pride mixed with a quiet resolve. She was about to say something when a familiar voice called her name. Turning, she saw Carla, her best friend, making her way through the crowd with her signature bright grin. Carla had been Alicia's rock throughout this entire ordeal, offering advice, comfort, and the occasional push when Alicia needed it most. "Look at you," Carla said, pulling Alicia into a tight hug. "Ms. Celebrity Advocate, ready to change the world." Alicia laughed, shaking her head. "Don't start, Carla. You know this wasn't my plan." Carla stepped back, her eyes sparkling with pride. "Maybe not, but it's exactly where you need to be. I'm so proud of you, Alicia. You're doing something incredible." Before Alicia could respond, the event coordinator approached, signaling that it was time for her to take the stage. Alicia felt a surge of nerves, but Carla squeezed her hand, giving her an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, Alicia walked toward the podium, her heart pounding as she faced the crowd. The room fell silent as she began to speak, her voice steady and strong. Thank you all for being here today. I know that each of you has come here with your own stories, your own struggles, and your own hopes for a better future. And I want you to know that I stand with you in that hope. The journey we're on is not an easy one, but it's a necessary one. She spoke of the night at the shopping plaza, of the fear and anger she had felt, but also of the courage she had found in standing up for herself. She spoke of the outpouring of support she had received, and the realization that her story was part of a larger tapestry, woven together by the experiences of countless others who had faced similar challenges. As she spoke, she felt the weight of her words settling over the crowd. She could see the emotions reflected in their faces, some nodding in agreement, others wiping away tears, each one connected to her story in their own way. Finally, she closed her speech with a simple message. We all have a voice, and that voice matters. Don't let anyone tell you that you're powerless. Stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with each of us, one step at a time. The room erupted in applause, the sound filling the space with a sense of unity and determination. Alicia felt a swell of pride, her heart full as she took in the sight of so many people standing with her, ready to fight for a better future. After the event, people lined up to shake her hand, to share their own stories, and to thank her for giving them hope. Alicia listened to each one, feeling both inspired and humbled by their courage. She realized that her journey was no longer just her own. It had become a shared struggle, a collective fight for justice and equality. As the crowd began to thin, a middle-aged man approached her, his expression serious but respectful. He introduced himself as Detective James Carter from the Houston Police Department. Alicia felt a flicker of unease, unsure of what to expect. "Miss Thompson," he began, his tone formal. "I just wanted to let you know that your case has had a significant impact within the department. I'm part of an internal task force investigating instances of misconduct and racial bias. What you did, standing up to Officer Williams, it's inspired change. And while we have a long way to go, I want you to know that we're committed to making things better." Alicia's eyes widened, surprise and relief washing over her. "Thank you, Detective Carter. That means a lot to me. I hope that this is just the beginning of real change." He nodded, his gaze steady. "So do I. And if there's anything you need, support, information, resources, you can count on me. We're not all like Williams, Miss Thompson. Some of us are fighting for the same things you are." Alicia shook his hand, feeling a spark of hope. She had faced so much hostility from the system, but here was someone on the inside who wanted to help, someone who believed in the same values she did. It was a small step, but it felt like a victory. As she left the community center that day, Alicia felt a sense of purpose settle within her. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, filled with both triumphs and setbacks, but she was no longer walking it alone. She had a community behind her, people who believed in her, and allies within the very system she was trying to change. Her phone buzzed as she reached her car, and she saw a text from Carla. "Proud of you today. Let's celebrate tonight." Alicia smiled, replying with a simple yes. She knew that tonight would be just one of many celebrations to come, not for fame or recognition, but for each victory, no matter how small, in the fight for justice. That evening, as she sat with Carla, laughing and reminiscing over dinner, Alicia felt a quiet certainty. She had found her path, one that was filled with purpose and guided by the strength she had discovered within herself. She was no longer just the woman in the video. She was a voice for change, a symbol of resilience, and a reminder that no one should have to stand alone. In that moment, she understood that her journey had only just begun, and she was ready to face whatever lay ahead with the same courage and determination that had brought her to this point. She was Alicia Thompson, and she was unbreakable. Facing the system. The weeks following Alicia's speech at the community center were a blur of meetings, interviews, and community gatherings. She found herself drawn deeper into the world of activism, learning the intricacies of organizing, advocacy, and the bureaucracy that came with trying to reform a system that had been resistant to change for so long. The experience was exhausting, exhilarating, and eye-opening all at once. One morning, Alicia sat in a small, dimly lit conference room, waiting for a meeting to begin. She had been invited by a coalition of local activists and civil rights lawyers who wanted her to join their efforts to push for police reform. Sitting across the table from her was Marcus Reed, a well-known activist and community organizer in Houston, and beside him was Clara Mendoza, a seasoned civil rights attorney with a reputation for tenacity. Marcus was a tall, imposing man in his 50s, his face lined with years of fighting for justice, his gaze steady and thoughtful. Clara was smaller in stature, but just as fierce, her eyes sharp and calculating. She had spent decades fighting cases of police misconduct, and her presence alone commanded respect. Alicia felt a wave of nervousness as they looked at her. She knew that joining forces with such experienced advocates was a significant step, one that could propel her even further into the public eye and bring new challenges. But she also knew that this was the next logical step if she wanted to make a lasting impact. Marcus cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Alicia, we're grateful to have you here. Your story has inspired so many, and we believe you can help us drive meaningful change. We've been working on a police reform initiative for years, but we need someone like you, a fresh voice, someone who can connect with the community on a personal level." Clara nodded, her expression warm yet focused. "Your case has become a rallying cry, Alicia. The footage of you standing up to Officer Williams, the way you handled yourself with grace and dignity, it's powerful. People are paying attention, and we want to help you leverage that influence." Alicia took a deep breath, her hands folded on the table. "I appreciate that, truly, but I'm still learning. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't have the experience that you both do. I just wanted to stand up for myself." Marcus leaned forward, his gaze intent. "That's exactly why you're the perfect person for this. People are tired of hearing the same voices. They want to see someone real, someone who's been through it. You bring authenticity, Alicia, and that's something this movement desperately needs." Clara reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on Alicia's. "We'll support you every step of the way. You don't have to do this alone. We have the legal knowledge, the resources, and the connections. But what we don't have is you, your courage, your story, your voice." Alicia felt a surge of determination, a flicker of the strength that had carried her through her encounter with Officer Williams. She nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "I'll do it. I'll join you." Over the next few weeks, Alicia dove headfirst into the world of advocacy. She attended strategy sessions, participated in community forums, and met with politicians who were open to discussing police reform. Clara and Marcus became her mentors, guiding her through the complexities of the legal and political landscapes. They taught her about policy proposals, how to navigate difficult conversations, and the art of effective storytelling to captivate audiences. One of the initiatives they were working on involved pushing for mandatory body cameras and stricter accountability measures within the police department. Alicia learned that while many officers wore body cameras, there were loopholes that allowed them to turn the cameras off at critical moments. This loophole, Marcus explained, was one of the many ways that misconduct could go unrecorded and unpunished. Alicia attended town hall meetings where she listened to community members share their own stories of encounters with the police. Some of the stories were heart-wrenching tales of lives disrupted, of loved ones lost to brutality or wrongful arrests. Each story added fuel to Alicia's resolve. She realized that her fight was no longer just about her encounter with Officer Williams. It was about standing up for everyone who had been silenced, ignored, or mistreated. One evening, as Alicia was preparing to leave the office she shared with Marcus and Clara, her phone rang. It was Detective James Carter, the officer who had approached her after the community center event, offering his support from within the police department. They had kept in touch, and he had become an unexpected ally, offering her insights into the department's inner workings and suggesting ways to approach her advocacy. "Detective Carter," Alicia greeted him, trying to keep her voice steady. "How are you?" "I'm all right, Alicia. But I wanted to let you know that something's happening on our end," he said, his tone serious. "The investigation into Williams is coming to a head. There's a lot of pressure from the public, and the department knows they can't brush this one under the rug. It looks like they're finally going to terminate him." Alicia felt a mixture of relief and sadness. While she was glad to see justice served, it was difficult to take satisfaction in someone losing their career. "Thank you for letting me know, Detective. It's good to hear that they're taking this seriously. There's more," he continued, his voice lowering. "The department's leadership is scrambling to manage the fallout. They're talking about implementing new training protocols and even starting a task force on racial bias. It's not much, but it's a start." Alicia's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected to see such immediate changes, but it gave her hope that her efforts, and the efforts of those around her, were making a difference. "That's encouraging," she said, a small smile forming. "Thank you, Detective Carter, for everything." After they ended the call, Alicia sat alone in the quiet office, her thoughts swirling. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from a single confrontation in a parking lot to becoming a voice for change. She thought about all the people who had supported her, the strangers who had reached out to her with words of encouragement, the activists who had welcomed her into their circle, and Detective Carter, who had shown her that there were people within the system who cared. But she also thought about the challenges ahead. She knew that real change wouldn't come overnight. There would be resistance, setbacks, and difficult conversations. There would be people who would try to discredit her, who would accuse her of seeking fame or causing trouble. But she was ready for it. She was no longer the same woman who had stood, trembling but resolute, in that parking lot. She had grown, found her strength, and discovered a purpose that went beyond her own life. A month later, Alicia sat across from a panel of city officials and law enforcement leaders at a public hearing. The room was packed with community members, activists, journalists, and city council members. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Alicia was there to testify in favor of a police reform bill that Marcus and Clara had helped draft. The bill called for stricter oversight of police conduct, mandatory de-escalation training, and accountability measures for officers who violated protocol. It was a bold proposal, one that would face significant opposition from within the police department and its unions, but Alicia and her allies knew it was necessary. As she took her seat at the witness table, she felt a wave of nerves wash over her. She glanced at Marcus and Clara, who gave her reassuring nods. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and began to speak. "Thank you, members of the council, for giving me the opportunity to speak today," she began, her voice clear and steady. "My name is Alicia Thompson, and I'm here today not just for myself, but for everyone who has been affected by police misconduct, for everyone who has been mistreated, ignored, or silenced." She recounted her encounter with Officer Williams, the fear and anger she had felt, and the courage it had taken to stand up for herself. She spoke about the impact the incident had on her life, the outpouring of support from the community, and the stories she had heard from others who had faced similar experiences. "Police officers hold a position of power and trust in our society," she said, her voice rising with emotion. "They are there to protect us, not to instill fear. And when that trust is broken, when people are hurt, humiliated, or even killed due to abuse of power, it is our duty to hold those responsible accountable." The room was silent, everyone hanging on her every word. "We need this reform," she continued. "We need to create a system that values accountability, that ensures officers are properly trained to de-escalate situations, and that makes it clear that no one is above the law. Change will not come easily, but it is necessary. We cannot continue to ignore the voices of those who have suffered. We cannot continue to accept a system that fails to protect all of us. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Alicia felt a surge of emotion as she looked around, seeing the faces of people who had come to support her, who believed in the vision of a fairer, more just system. She glanced at Marcus and Clara, their faces filled with pride, and felt a sense of accomplishment she had never known before. The hearing continued with testimony from other community leaders, activists, and officials. But Alicia knew that her words had left an impact, that her voice had been heard. She had faced the system, challenged it, and demanded change, not just for herself, but for everyone who believed in justice. As she left the hearing, Alicia was greeted by a crowd of supporters outside the building. They cheered, clapped, and reached out to shake her hand, to thank her for being their voice. In that moment, Alicia realized that her journey was far from over. The fight would continue, and there would be more battles to face. But she was ready for it. She walked away from the hearing that day with her head held high, her heart filled with purpose. Alicia Thompson had become more than a voice for change. She had become a force for it. And she knew that as long as she stood firm, as long as she continued to speak up, real change was possible. A legacy of change. Alicia stood in front of the large modern building that now housed the newly formed Houston Center for Justice and Community Empowerment. The organization had been the combined brainchild of Marcus, Clara, and Alicia herself, born from their shared vision of a world where people wouldn't have to fear those who were meant to protect them. After months of tireless work, fundraising, and community organizing, they had secured enough funding to make the center a reality. The building had once been an old bank, and they had renovated it into a welcoming space with rooms for legal counseling, community workshops, and a large open hall for town meetings. Today was the grand opening, and as Alicia looked at the line of people waiting outside, a surge of pride and emotion welled up within her. What had started as a single act of defiance in a parking lot had grown into a full-fledged movement, a collective push for accountability and equality that was making waves beyond the borders of Houston. She hadn't set out to become an activist, but life had a way of leading people to places they never imagined for themselves. Inside, the hall was buzzing with excitement. Community members, local leaders, and activists mingled, and families sat together, children playing in a designated area. Volunteers handed out pamphlets detailing the center services, free legal aid for cases of police misconduct, community safety workshops, youth mentorship programs, and public forums to address issues impacting local neighborhoods. Alicia had insisted on including a wide range of services to address not only police accountability, but also the underlying issues that contributed to systemic inequality. Marcus and Clara were waiting for her by the podium at the front of the room, where she would give the opening speech. Both of them had become family to her over the past year. Marcus had become a mentor, and Clara, a source of wisdom and resilience. Together, they had helped Alicia realize the power of organized, persistent action. Clara caught her eye, giving her an encouraging nod. "Ready?" she asked with a warm smile. Alicia took a deep breath, feeling the significance of the moment. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, smiling back. She made her way to the podium, and as the crowd fell silent, she looked out at the sea of faces before her, people from all walks of life, united by a common purpose. Alicia's heart swelled with gratitude and determination. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice strong and clear. "Today is more than just the opening of a building. It's the beginning of a new chapter, not only for me but for our entire community. This center exists because each of you has chosen to stand up for justice, to believe in the possibility of change, and to demand a system that serves and protects us all." The audience listened intently, many nodding in agreement. Alicia continued, drawing strength from their attention. "I remember a time, not so long ago, when I didn't believe my voice could make a difference," she said. "I was just an ordinary person, going about my life, until one night changed everything. But it wasn't just that night. It was the response, the outpouring of support from people like you. the stories I heard from others who had faced similar situations. I learned that our voices are stronger together, that change isn't just something we ask for, it's something we create. She paused, letting her words sink in. This center is a place for all of us, she continued. A place where we can come together, learn from one another, and build a safer, more just community. We'll provide legal support, advocate for reform, and educate our youth. But most importantly, we'll empower each and every person who walks through these doors to know their worth, to know their rights, and to know that they are not alone. Alicia glanced over at Marcus and Clara, who both nodded in encouragement, their eyes shining with pride. "Today, we're making a promise," Alicia said, her voice filled with conviction. "A promise to hold those in power accountable, a promise to fight for fairness, and a promise to protect the dignity of every individual in our community. This is just the beginning, and together, I know we can make a lasting difference." The room erupted in applause, the sound filling every corner of the building. Alicia felt a rush of emotion, her heart pounding as she took in the smiles, the cheers, the hope that filled the air. She had found her purpose, her voice, and now she was helping others find theirs. After the speech, people approached her, thanking her for her courage, sharing their own stories, and expressing how much the center meant to them. Alicia listened, offering hugs and words of encouragement. The feeling was overwhelming, but it was also fulfilling in a way she had never experienced before. In the months that followed, the center became a beacon of hope in the community. Alicia, Marcus, and Clara worked tirelessly, alongside a growing team of volunteers and staff, to provide resources and support. Alicia led workshops on knowing one's rights during encounters with law enforcement, while Clara hosted legal clinics for people who needed help navigating the justice system. Marcus organized youth mentorship programs, pairing young people with positive role models and teaching them about leadership and resilience. Alicia found herself inspired every day by the people who came to the center. She met mothers who were fighting to protect their children, young men and women who wanted to make a difference, and elders who shared stories of the struggles they had faced in the past. Each person reminded her why this work mattered, why the fight for justice was worth every challenge. One day, Alicia was in her office, reviewing notes for an upcoming town hall meeting, when Detective James Carter walked in. She looked up in surprise, setting her papers aside as he approached her desk. "Detective Carter," she greeted him warmly. "It's good to see you. What brings you here?" He smiled, his face lined with a mixture of pride and gratitude. "I just wanted to check in, see how things are going here, and to thank you." Alicia raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Thank me?" He nodded, his expression earnest. "You may not realize it, but what you've done here, it's made a difference, even inside the department. There are officers who are inspired by what you're doing. Some of them have started speaking up about things they used to ignore. They're questioning practices they took for granted. Change is happening, Alicia, and a lot of that is because of you." Alicia felt a swell of emotion. She had hoped that her efforts would reach beyond the community, that they might inspire change within the system itself. But hearing it from Detective Carter made it real. "Thank you, Detective," she said softly. "That means a lot to me." He hesitated, then added, "And I'd like to help, if there's any way I can. I know I'm just one person, but I believe in what you're doing. I want to be part of this." Alicia's face lit up with a smile. "We could always use more allies. Let's talk about how you can get involved." They spent the next hour discussing ways Detective Carter could support the center's work, from offering workshops on de-escalation to advocating for reform within the department. Alicia felt a renewed sense of hope. The ripple effect of her actions was reaching places she hadn't anticipated, and she knew that this partnership would strengthen their efforts. Years passed, and the Houston Center for Justice and Community Empowerment continued to thrive. Alicia had become a respected figure in her city, a voice for justice and compassion, a leader who was unafraid to challenge the status quo. The center's influence spread, inspiring similar initiatives in neighboring cities and across the state. Alicia's journey had changed her in ways she couldn't have imagined. She had found strength she didn't know she had, forged friendships that felt like family, and discovered a purpose that gave her life new meaning. She had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that one person's courage could ignite a movement. But more than anything, Alicia had come to understand the power of community. She knew that change was never the work of one individual. It was the collective effort of people coming together, supporting one another, and refusing to accept injustice. One quiet evening, after a long day at the center, Alicia sat alone in her office, reflecting on the path that had brought her here. She thought about that night in the parking lot, the confrontation that had sparked everything. What had once been a moment of fear and anger had transformed into a journey of purpose and growth. She had faced adversity, but she had also found allies, discovered strength, and built a legacy it would live on. As she looked around the office, filled with photos and mementos from events, letters of gratitude from people whose lives had been changed by the center, Alicia felt a profound sense of peace. She knew that the fight for justice would continue long after she was gone, and she was grateful to have played a part in it. The world wasn't perfect, and there was still much work to be done. But as long as there were people willing to stand up, to speak out, and to support one another, she knew that change was possible. Alicia took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her journey, but also the lightness of knowing she was exactly where she was meant to be. She closed her eyes, a small smile playing on her lips, and whispered a quiet promise to herself.